Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists for today. First, we have Mr. Todd McFarland, who's the Deputy General Counsel for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Mr. Tim Schultz, who's the president of the First Amendment Partnership. We have Mr. Lawrence Brown, who's the senior pastor of the Queensboro Seventh-day Adventist Church in New York City. And we also have Dr. Timothy Golden, who's a professor of philosophy at Whitman College. Gentlemen, great having you here and looking forward to our topics for today. You know, it's an interesting topic that's been going on, in particular with the D.C. Department of Corrections. And they have tried to revise a certain dietary policy that they had in place based on a lawsuit that was brought by the ACLU against the District of Columbia on behalf of an individual by the name of Riley Benjamin, who was a Jewish resident who was in custody. While he was in custody, there was some question regarding whether or not he should be able to have food that matched his dietary constraints as to being a Jew. And as a result thereof, we found that the district government was saying that that should not be their responsibility. And then later on, they tried to come back in and to rechange the policy to make sure that things are put in place. You know, Tim Golden, when I take a look at this type of situation and you start thinking about people who are part of a court system or find themselves incarcerated, the idea that they would be in a position to basically request what type of food they will have seems to be almost a bridge too far, but from a religious perspective, I guess maybe it's not. I mean, what's the viewpoint here?
Well, that's right, Orland. It seems to be a bridge too far, but it really isn't. Among the many things that we forfeit when we commit crimes and get sentenced to periods of incarceration, the obvious forfeiture we have is forfeiture of our freedom of movement, freedom from court supervision, surveillance, all that sort of thing. But one of the things that we don't lose is the freedom to practice our religious beliefs. And that travels with us even through conviction and sentencing and incarceration. And what we had here was a situation in which prison officials wanted Mr. Benjamin to get a letter verifying that he was Jewish before they granted him the exemption with the kosher meal and so forth. And the issue here was really state officials, prison officials demanding some sort of verification from him. And so that's what he contested. And state officials ended up withdrawing the verification requirement. And now he's allowed, simply on his assertion of his Jewish identity, to be granted the exception. And I think perhaps that's as it should be. We don't want state officials involved in adjudicating whether or not someone is or is not a member of a certain religion. And I think that's the way that this case shook out. So it's important to remember that although we don't have hierarchies of constitutional rights, there is a sense in which we cherish religious freedom such that it does follow us even behind prison walls. And this was probably the right outcome in this case, I think.
You know, Tim Schultz, I don't quite get it, though. If you're in a situation where, say, this starts to increase the cost of what goes on from a dietary standpoint at these prisons, we're basically now asking, I guess, taxpayers to be responsible for special meals for individuals who've engaged in wrongdoing. I understand the idea of protecting one's religious belief, but maybe what ends up happening is that you just may have to, eat those things that may be, quote unquote, available to you that just, quote unquote, may not be kosher. I mean, is that too much to ask? And that seems to be what the other side is saying.
Well, I do think it's too much to ask because the cost is de minimis. And I know that you as a Seventh-day Adventist have certain dietary restrictions. And I think that if someone in the Adventist church was incarcerated and told that pork was all that was on the menu, right, that would be a problem. And so I think that as Dr. Golden correctly says, We respect people's sincerely held religious beliefs. I understand there's an infamous case where someone joined a new religion called the Church of the Chateaubriand, where they said they had to have high quality beef at every meal. Okay, prisoners have been known to lie, and so having a sincerity test about dietary restrictions is absolutely appropriate. But I think that the very de minimis cost of recognizing people's sincerely held dietary religious restrictions is absolutely appropriate in a free and just society.
Well, Todd, what's the problem with the verification concept? I mean, you want a special meal. Is there something that's bad about me making sure that what you're telling me actually makes sense and there's some validity to it? I mean, I'm not expected to know all the principles of anyone's religious beliefs, am I?
No, the challenge is that, do you really want a religious a government deciding whether a person truly is part of a religion or not, or deciding if certain beliefs are true or accurate or a sham? And that puts the government and government officials in a very difficult position. I think that the thing that differentiates this gentleman's claim, Mr. Riley, versus the situation Tim talked about is he's only simply asking for something that is available. And so he wasn't making up a religion. He wasn't coming up with something that was a sham or wasn't sincere. He's asking for something that is generally available. Now, it is true, and this is what's motivating all of this, is cost. And Tim called it de minimis, and I agree that in the grand scheme of things, especially in a First Amendment claim, this is not a relevant factor. But the cost per meal for a kosher meal, because I've done this kind of litigation before, is multiple times what it is for a regular meal. Like, they can often feed prisoners for $1.25 a meal at most, sometimes less. And then a kosher meal could be as much as $7 a meal. And they are, generally speaking, higher quality food and better food. But again, the situation, we had a case where someone had reached out to us asking for us to help, and he claimed to observe certain feasts that are in the Old Testament that talk about, eating and drinking what you want, and what he wanted was 2 cheese pizzas and a steak. We did not take that case, but, the courts do have to have a sense here if they're being sort of scammed, but asking for a kosher meal is not a scam. This is a belief that is held broadly outside of the corrections context.
I understand why you didn't take the case, but I have to say that gentleman is a cell block legend.
Well, Lawrence, when you think about all of this activity, the real question is we're at a point now where, you've got artificial intelligence organizations or operations that are even creating new religions for people. And so the whole idea of what now becomes a quote unquote religious belief based on what I may be feeling as it relates to my religious beliefs seems to be starting to get a little bit murky. I know you may be going a little far when you want 2 pizzas and a steak, but at the end of the day, is it really going too far if this is your new religion? I mean, we can laugh about some of these things, but there are religions that are currently out there that have some laughable things that go on in there as well. And so how do you end up drawing the line as to, when we're going to see these new, artificial intelligence created concepts and religions, and somebody's going to be expecting protections?
Well, you've always had the need for some sort of balancing act. That's nothing new. But what is new is that we seem to be developing into a time where people want to be able to take every little quirk about them, elevate it to the status of, religious necessity, and go from there. And that's a problem. It's a problem because let's move outside of this context for a moment. When you get into the wider sphere, you begin to realize that we're not all little gods walking around on this planet, and we don't all get to, make up our own worship system. There's got to be a mechanism. There's got to be a way to keep things generally balanced. And even from the verification standpoint, I served as religious liberty director for years. And if you needed something, you could call me, walk into my office, pick it up. You don't have that luxury in prison. And so just the fact that it's so much more problematic trying to get in touch with someone who could verify a thing in the first place, that's a problem. But I'm troubled that our world has turned into what it has turned into. And every little crazy thing that somebody wants to do, rather than having somebody check them on it and call them on it, They want to be able to just do what they want to do, live how they want to live, and it's my religion, you deal with it. That's a problem.
I was just wanted to sort of second what Dr. Brown just said, but I wanted to make this point. The criminal defense lawyer in me, you can take me out of the courtroom, but you can't take the courtroom out of me. We're sort of having this conversation without making room for the real possibility that some people who are incarcerated may be innocent, right? And we're kind of operating on the assumption that a conviction means actual guilt, and that's not always the case. Now, I don't want to get into litigating innocence claims and making that the standard for whether or not people get religious accommodations, but it is to say that I think we have to hold some space open for the real possibility that not everyone who is asking for religious accommodation while incarcerated may be an actual guilty person. So I think that's important to put that out there.
But I guess, Tim Schultz, how do you stop the idea that, someone's in prison and just decides they want a higher quality level meal and decide that they're going to call themselves part of a certain religious group, that you don't have the power to seek any type of verification? Or is it the idea that that's not their problem, that's the prison's problem? And if you decide that you're all sitting down there and I've got yesterday's oatmeal and I look over and I see this great kosher meal beside me and I give the proverbial, I'd want to have what he's having, where do we go too far on this?
Orland, this is a hypothetical that requires me to have a knowledge of prison life that I just don't have. And all I can say is you kind of cross that bridge when you come to it. I don't think we've seen an explosion of kosher meal requests on that basis. I think maybe one solution is we need to treat all incarcerated people better than we currently do. I think it's fine to spend more money on better meals for incarcerated people. I think the way you treat incarcerated people, even those that are guilty, right, is a test of the justice of a society. And so that's I think maybe a better way to think about it.
And if I could just follow up on Tim's point, Orland, I think whatever cost it is, whether it's de minimis or significant, I know Todd and Tim have talked about that a little bit here in this segment. It's essentially the cost of doing democracy, right?
Yes, and humanity.
And in the end, if people are going to make religious claims for religious exemptions in bad faith, well, that's just the way it is. And government, I think, just has to live with that, because I think on balance, we would rather live in a society in America where religious freedom is respected as opposed to living in one where religious freedom is policed. And I don't think any of us want the latter, but we hope for and should try to strive for the former.
No, I think you're probably right with that, Tim, that sometimes there is a cost to democracy and humanity, and as a society, we should be willing to pay it under those circumstances. Gentlemen, there was an interesting case that I was reading about the other day. It was entitled Huntsman versus the Corporation of the President of the Church of Jesus Christ and Latter-day Saints. And this was a case that ironically just had a recent split decision. The appeals court basically reinstated a part of a case of a man that was seeking a return of the tithe that he had paid to the LDS Church. In a 2-1 vote, the Ninth Circuit actually reversed the lower court's opinion to throw it out and actually thought the idea should be sent back for some more conversation. I can't understand how we start to now have courts that are really beginning to take on the issue of whether or not funds I have given to a church may have been a defraud to me in some form or fashion because they ended up doing something with the money that I deemed was inappropriate, or they may have told me in some public document or private document that was not going to take the place. Todd, you're somebody who represents a church on a worldwide basis. Help me to understand a little bit this fraudulent claim about the fact that someone had really paid a tithe to a church and now would like about 7 years of it back because he believes they didn't do what they told him they were going to do. Is this crazy?
Sure. So just in full disclosure, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, of which I'm deputy counsel of, did join an amicus brief in support of the Church of Jesus Christ in this case on a petition for rehearing. But no, the facts of this have a little bit more nuance. James Huntsman, by the way, this last name, Huntsman, this family is an old line Church of Jesus Christ members. Relatives have been everything from, governor of the state. I think there was a great grandfather, something maybe a member of the Quorum of the 12, just a long church family. He had donated money for several years, had by his own account become disillusioned with the church's stance on Prop 8 and then some other really around LGBT and women issues as far as in ministry, become disenfranchised with the church, quit coming, I think dropped his membership. Then a couple of years ago, there was a whistleblower who filed an IRS complaint, and then that was leaked by his brother to the Washington Post, which alleged that the Church of Jesus Christ had over $100 billion in reserve funds. As part of that, it also disclosed they had invested some of the money in a couple of different investments, including propping up a failed life insurance company, and then also a redevelopment of downtown Salt Lake City. And this redevelopment occurred back in the 08-09 timeframe. Prior to that, the president of the Church of Jesus Christ at that time had assured people in a speech that they wouldn't be using tithe money for that redevelopment. There had been other official statements along the same lines that they were using other funds, funds from some of their for-profit businesses and other church funds. As it turned out, they didn't use tithe money per se. What they did use, though, was the proceeds, the investment proceeds off of tithe money. And in Mr. Huntsman's view, this was a form of fraud. They told him we weren't going to use your money for X. They used it for X. And so what the Ninth Circuit said was, well, a jury needs to decide this. And there was a dissent on this. And we a lot of us feel that higher courts or the Ninth Circuit may take a look at this again. But yes, this idea that just because, you paid tithe and you got disillusioned with the church and other issues, you can now just simply look to try to get your tithe money back would open up churches to a lot of litigation and really make their finances pretty unsustainable.
Well, Lawrence, I think that there are a lot of church members that think that this is pretty reasonable. I mean, the idea of kind of doing what you said you were going to do or not doing what you said you were not going to do should be kind of part of the principle of me, turning over my donations to you? Or is it a situation that once you, quote unquote, donate, there should be no reason for you to have any question? But apparently the Ninth Circuit's going to have to deal with this.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, as a former stewardship director for the Northeastern Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, I would like to point out to our listening audience that people talk about paying tithe. You don't pay tithe, you return it. Because in principle, it was never yours. God identified that 10% as his. All of it belongs to him, really. But in his word, he declares that 10%, he's reserved it for himself. And it's our faithful duty and responsibility to return it to him as a part of our relationship with him. Now, having said that, if it comes to light that from the time you put your money in the plate, the treasurer is walking out the back door and going down to the racetrack to play the ponies. Once we find that out, we've got to hold people accountable. But here's what people have to understand. Your responsibility to God is what it is. And when you do what God has asked you to do, you have fulfilled your responsibility. And if somebody else is not doing the right thing, they'll have to answer for that. And so I say that because it is inappropriate to ask for a refund when you feel that something has been misappropriated. I'm not applauding misappropriation, but I need for people to understand faithfulness requires obedience. And when people get mad, I didn't like the pastor they sent me, I'm going to withhold my tithe. That's a problem. All God said to do was to return what's his. There's a better way to address what you feel may amount to fraudulent behavior, but it's problematic to take it upon yourself to call for a refund when, in essence, you were simply doing what God asked you to do in the first place.
Well, you know, Tim Schultz, I heard what Dr. Brown just said, and I probably would join his church after that statement. But my question that I've got to understand
the whole time
is the idea that at some point, if you believe what's happening with your funds is fraudulent, anywhere else in the world of the United States, you've got a claim. What makes church so special if I don't look at this from a stewardship standpoint, and if the law doesn't believe that it already belonged to the church and already belonged to God, and somehow they come with the notion, actually, we think it belonged to you. And the fact that it belonged to you, you should have the ability to kind of see what's happening with it. And if there's a problem, you should call them on it. Now, that sounds like what we're working with here, that somebody feels they have to call somebody on it. And what the courts decide in the long run, it still sounds like the calling may be appropriate here.
So I think that there's lots of remedies that are available to somebody like Mr. Huntsman, who has a lot of money, clearly, right? One is he can fund a PR campaign saying my church is wrong. He has a First Amendment right to do that. He can agitate the prosecutors if he thinks there's been actual prosecutable criminal fraud. There hasn't been. That's ludicrous, right? But he could do that. And, you know, people can be prosecuted for fraud in the example that Dr. Brown mentioned, right? The church, you're not immune from the fraud statutes for criminal fraud if you steal money. But that's different from essentially second guessing the way the money is spent. Especially when you have a guy here who clearly is just is a rich guy with an axe to grind, ideological axe to grind against his church. If everybody like that were allowed to sue their churches and you know, have fraud trials where juries decide, right, about whether these questions are correct or not, that is potentially the end of tithing in America. You know what I mean? Or not the end, but it would massively impact how people, how churches, how houses of worship, fundraise and get their money. And so, like, there's all kinds of avenues available for somebody like Mr. Huntsman. I just don't think getting the money back on a fraud theory in civil suit is one of them.
Well, I got to tell you, Tim, somebody who used to be out there working cases on a regular basis, if this is where we're going, I'm assuming you might actually leave academia and get back in the courtroom again. I mean, where would this stop? I mean, it seems like there'd be enough business forever on a process like this.
That's right, Orland. And to follow up on Tim's point that he just made, the ecclesiastical abstention doctrine, which is what the court has applied in this case, is what it is for a reason. We don't want government getting involved in church disputes, deciding what is legitimate, in the same way that we don't want government deciding who is really a member of what religion. I think that the doctrine is based on this idea that if government not establishing religion means anything, it means that you can't have the courts involved in litigation over disputes that are taking place within the church. Again, to Tim's point, absent some legitimate finding of prosecutable criminal behavior, the government has rightly said, and the courts have rightly said, you can't bring your disputes here. And I think it's the right way to proceed in these kinds of cases. So again, to Pastor Brown's point, just like if the pastor is going to take the tithe and go to the track, that's a problem, but that's doesn't really affect the moral obligation, right, or the spiritual obligation that we have to, or that people who return tithe believe that they have. So I think the courts have, in this case, rightly declined to involve themselves, and I think that's the way it should be.
But I still got to ask this question, and this is for any of the individuals here. The idea that now we're seeing a lot of politicians talk about the concept that there should be no separation of church and state. We have people even running on a campaign of it should all be combined. It sounds like what they're trying to do is get us closer to the idea that if you are, quote unquote, in a religious organization, no matter what you're doing, we should treat you the same. And my guess would be that the first thing that they're going to try to grab onto is the financial aspect of it. Am I overstating this, or what are your thoughts?
Well, here's the thing, and this is something I've been looking at because I find it very troubling. It is a denial of history to claim that this country did not purposefully and intentionally establish a system designed on separation of church and state. That's the argument people are trying to make. History totally rejects that notion. And today, for people to try and act as though there are no parade of horribles that grows out of failing to separate the two, they're just not paying attention. And we can go back and see what happens over and over again when those two entities are put together.
So I think I kind of agree and maybe slightly disagree with this, because I think one can believe, as I do, that the Constitution does separate church and state, right? And that can be different from believing the kind of 1940s, 1950s era Justice Hugo Black understanding of what separation of church and state requires. And so we do have, I think, in some cases, an elite understanding among secular Americans about what separation of church and state means that I think has colored a lot of whether people believe in separation of church and state. And so I think lots of bad opinions are based on overreactions to other wrong opinions or overcorrections. And I think that a lot of this idea on the right, especially that there's no such thing, is itself based on an overreaction to a kind of leftist secular understanding that the Constitution views religion as dangerous, and that's why we have to separate church and state, right? And that, of course, is not the reason that the founders separated church and state.
I'm gonna have to let that be the last word on this, Tim, but I think you've hit it spot on, that you may be able to have a separation of religion and government, but the actual concepts of what goes on in the church and what goes on in the state will find itself playing together much more regularly than we could ever understand. But I'm sure this is something we're gonna talk about again in the future. Tim Golden, tell me something I don't know.
Supreme Court recently granted certiorari in a case called Garland versus Cargill, related to the authority of the Department of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms to declare bump stocks machine guns. Chief Justice John Roberts will vote with the progressive justices in this case, but it won't be enough. The court will rule 5-4 that the ATF exceeded its authority.
Wow. Lawrence Brown, tell me something I don't know.
There was a prisoner who went to jail on a domestic dispute. His sentence got bumped up when he threatened to kill the judge. Yeah, I don't know why he did that. But he came from a rich family, and they decided he needed a special diet. So this family paid for a nutritionist to come every day, fix his food. It cost him like $4,000 a month, and he got to eat his meals in his cell. This happened in 2002. DoorDash didn't start until 2013. He was a man ahead of his time.
Oh, my goodness. Todd McFarland, tell me something I don't know.
The Fifth Circuit recently remanded a case of a pro se corrections officer in Texas who was terminated because he refused to shave his beard. Under the new Supreme Court standard in Groff, the Fifth Circuit said, sorry, District Court, you got to try again. He may win underneath the better standard.
Wow. Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
With the outbreak of anti-Semitism in the United States and across the world, the federal program for security grants for houses of worship and other religiously oriented institutions is more important than ever. That security grant program is put at risk by the Equality Act, and that's one of the reasons why the Equality Act will never pass.
Wow. Well, listen, gentlemen, I appreciate all that and looking forward to having another conversation soon. Thanks again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.